tornem a ser aquí, avui per parlar de l'educació professional militar, amb el doctor Corum. Com ja, si no el coneixeu d'altres vegades, doncs el Corum és tinent coronel retirat de l'exèrcit dels Estats Units, amb 6 anys de servei actiu i 22 a la reserva. Alhora és doctor en història i en l'àmbit acadèmic va estar fent de professor durant 14 anys a la Universitat de la US Air Force. També va ser degà del Col·legi de Defensa Bàltic, l'organització acadèmica que forma els oficials al comandament de les 3 repúbliques bàltiques. I també és autor d'una onzena de llibres, 70 capítols i infinitat d'articles, a banda de ser un dels especialistes a nivell mundial sobre comandament i doctrina en diversos àmbits. Sigui com sigui, benvinguts altre cop. I bé, procedem. So, James, as usual, the floor is yours.
It's not a very dramatic title, but it's actually the talk that I'm giving is drawn from a paper, a manual that I've written. And if you get bored and go to sleep, there's no problem because I'm actually talking from the high points of the article. And so if you don't like my presentation, and are still interested, you can go ahead and read it. So if you want to take a nap now, it's okay. You'll get all of this information from reading the article. Purpose of my presentation is very simple. I am sharing my experience with you. I spent as an Army Reserve officer, I spent 8 years in a specialized unit, which we have a number of in the United States. And it was an Army Reserve unit that did, 87th Division, that did operational level simulations exercises. And we did all over the eastern part of the United States. I also spent 17 years teaching in American staff and war colleges. And at the staff and war colleges, operational exercises and war games and staff rides are a very big part of our education. So I've been involved in organizing them, planning operational education and exercises, observing exercises, assessing exercises, and staff rides and war games. I've actually created one war game. I've created some staff rides of my own, and then worked with others in many other cases. So in over a couple of decades, I've picked up a few basic things and just want to pass on this practical knowledge. And this is to provide an overview of using operational exercises and simulations and war games and staff rides so that you can educate commanders and staffs and whole units. Now, at the operational level of war, and I would simply define that as something above battalion, brigade and above, the operational level of war, the emphasis is in developing leadership skills of the commanders and the staffs. Now, there are 4 goals to conducting operational exercise. The first goal is to teaching, and this is always the goal of what you want to do in an exercise, is you want to teach the operational art and the practical doctrine for planning, and you want to make commanders and staffs go through a systematic military decision-making process. There are actually manuals and books on how how the process works. The second goal is certification. Now, this happens when you have to deploy a large military unit to an active theater, whether it's as peacekeepers or a conflict or a deterrent, and you will not commit major units until they have been certified. You run them through operational exercises to see their skill level, and if it doesn't meet the proper skill level that's expected by doctrine, you run them through another exercise and then another. And this actually has happened many times in the mobilization 1991 for that Gulf War, which involved many of the European countries. Some of the American units had to go through 3 or 4 major exercises before the Army Training Command said, yes, you're now ready to go. Your commanders and staffs can function effectively. This happens every time we do a major military deployment, is that you have to go through exercises until they say you've met the standard. But that's really in the real war, real conflict situations where you really deploy people. For the everyday, run-of-the-mill peacetime soldier, it's number 3. The most common goal of an operational exercise is assessment. And what this means is that the operational unit actually gets in contact with a training simulation specialist unit, and they arrange for an exercise. And this exercise is to evaluate the knowledge and training level of commanders and staffs. And this is meant to perform a critical assessment of their skills so that the commander and staff of the unit that is being exercised, a brigade or division or major logistics command, they will take their assessment of their strengths and weaknesses from the exercise, and they will develop their training plan for the next year or two to emphasize maintaining their strengths and effective points, but finding their weak points in the exercise and emphasizing those issues in their training plan. So it's an aid to the commander. And then the final goal of an operational exercise is to test doctrine. This is done occasionally. And you will have the higher-ups in your defense ministry come up with different concepts of unit organization and doctrine, and you will try them out in an operational exercise to see how they work. And again, it's meant to be an assessment, and you can look and find flaws and try to fix those. Now, operational training is the key to success in a modern conflict. In World War I, no nation could undertake a major offensive or action without establishing a strong superiority in troops, in artillery firepower, in logistics, in reserves, and in air power. And you will note in all of your major World War I campaigns, the emphasis of the successful campaigns is to try to bring great superiority to bear during the offensive. And all the great 1918 offensives, this is what they sought. Now, 22 years later, in 1940, we have a situation where the Germans in the West had 120 divisions, and they faced 120 Allied divisions. The Germans had 20 divisions that were armored and motorized, and the Allied forces had 20 divisions that were motorized and armored. The Allies had a very strong advantage in tanks. Not only that, they had a quality advantage in tanks. The French had a 2-to-1 artillery superiority over the Germans. The Germans had a fairly slight superiority in air power, at least in numbers, and some qualitative superiority. But the overall situation is the Germans didn't have any great superiority at all in May 1940. Yet, in contrast to 1918, they decisively defeated the Allies in 3 weeks without excessive losses. Now, what was the German superiority? The Germans had only one really significant superiority over the Allies in May 1940, and that was they had constant maneuvers and large-scale, large unit exercises and testing and training their commanders and staffs for operational level of warfare. Operational level exercises were almost unknown in the British and French Army. And they occasionally had large maneuvers, but again, these were seldom. In May 1940, any captain in the German Army had been on more multi-division exercises and maneuvers than any general in the French Army. And that's pretty astounding. The Germans simply had practiced constantly how to coordinate and command large-scale warfare operations, and including divisions, corps, and armies. In the Allies, they had some wonderfully trained battalions. They did not train to work as divisions and corps and armies, and that's why they lose in 1940 so readily. It was the training differential at the operational level that did that, and this is the most dramatic example. I can give you any conflict in history and tell you that any modern conflict, certainly, where the training difference was the one great significant factor that allowed in conventional war. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to unconventional war. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But in conventional war, it's the difference in operational level training that really is the key thing. Now, go to the basics and we'll talk about the levels of training. Now, the first level of military training is individual skills. Each soldier has to know individual skills. Everyone has to get a military specialty or two or three, and they have to go to a course and they have to be certified that they know those skills. You will not allow somebody to operate a radar or drive a tank unless they have gone through the course and proven they can operate the radar and drive the tank. The next step is taking the trained individuals and putting them into units and training a small unit, whether it's a team of 15, 20 people, a small platoon, or up to company, up to, let's say, 200 people. And this, you have small unit exercises, small unit training to build that team to function effectively. You already know all about this. You have fire departments that spend most of their time training to fight fires, and they will train as teams to fight a major fire. Police, they will train in teamwork, let's say, to deal with civil disorder or a natural disaster to deploy in teams. The military, exactly the same thing, very similar types of training and team building and team leadership development. Then you get to large units. Now, this is where the operational level of war and training and leadership kicks in a serious way. But you can only do the operational level if you have well-trained individuals doing the basic tasks, communicating, moving, shooting, and then well-trained teams at the smaller level. Then you build to the operational level. And here's a typical example of a U.S. military specialist course. I could show this for any military, any Western military. It's the Army Reserve 3-week Master Gunner course at Fort Hunter Liggett. And when you finish the course, you are trained as a Master Gunner in infantry or mechanized unit. Now, the best way to train people is to do the training with full-scale, all entire units, entire divisions and brigades will deploy with their equipment, or entire air groups or air wings will deploy with all of their aircraft. And in the United States, we have a massive training center, National Training Center Fort Irwin, which is a vast region of the California Mojave Desert. And every few years, large units will be brought there, and they have a professional, a brigade, reinforced brigade size, a very large, very well-equipped opposing force. And they will have open maneuvers with real troops, real tanks, real planes, everything real. And every vehicle has a transponder on it. And when they shoot the laser rounds and it sets off, and that tank is theoretically destroyed, that's all recorded on by computer. Every movement of every vehicle is recorded for both sides. So at the end of each segment of part of play, they will meet together and they can replay, says, well, you moved your brigade, here you're moving here in the desert, and here you got ambushed by the other guys. You can see all on the screen. Nobody can disagree. It's all there recorded. If you have the Red Flag Air Force exercises at Nellis Air Force Base, which takes place over a vast part of the Nevada desert, and you have a professional, very well-trained, equipped opposing force flying against you, you also have simulated anti-aircraft defenses and radar systems. And again, every aircraft has a transponder, and every movement is monitored, and you fly these missions in real life, and you have the real-life opposing forces and contesting you, and you lose the aircraft. And again, at the end of each segment of play, they play out the entire unit and their movement and their strike mission, and they can show where the aircraft were theoretically, where they were shot down by the anti-aircraft, or where they were taken out by enemy fighters and so forth. This is wonderful training. It is realistic. It's real. All the troops are involved, all the equipment. But there's a problem. It costs a gigantic amount of money to do real-life training. During the Cold War, we used to actually fly entire American National Guard divisions to Europe. They'd get off the aircraft, and they would be bused to these big depots where we had tanks, trucks, artillery, everything ready to go. And they got off the airplane, they got in the tank, and they drove off, and they started playing these division and corps maneuvers with the Bundeswehr and the British and the French and the Allied forces. And they did this every year. They lasted about 10 days. And it was a wonderful way to train people for operational level of warfare. By the way, it was also expensive. Cold War ends, and we also have computer systems now that are becoming more sophisticated that can play a bigger role in our training. And for cost purposes, it's a tiny fraction of the cost to simulate the soldiers. And so a war game or an operational exercise, you don't actually deploy units. You don't deploy equipment. You basically exercise the commanders and staffs of the units, and all the equipment and the combat action and so forth are all played in simulation. And of course, you'll have an opposing force and so on. So this is a wonderful, wonderful way to train people. It's really expensive. So you try to, it's not a realistic, occasionally smaller nations will send observers and take part in a small way, but frankly, it's not cost effective. So we have moved as our main way to do operational training and simulations exercise. And this applies to the big countries like the United States, and it applies to the small countries, as small as Estonia. So everything is simulated, and it's pretty effective. And so this has become the norm in all the Western countries. Now, what you need for an exercise like this is a simulation center, someplace where you have either regular military or contract civilians who will make the simulations with the computer work in the gameplay. And I have been to a great many simulation centers. In America, we have quite a few of them. Estonia has a very good simulation center. And in the simulation center in Estonia, the Estonian higher units and commanders can bring their commanders and staffs to the simulation center. They can take part over the computer in multinational NATO exercises that are played out across a vast theater of Europe, and they can play their part all in simulation. And I've been to Austria. Now, Austria is not a NATO country, but they have a very good, very modern simulation center. And operational, large-scale Austrian units participate in multinational NATO exercises, which I find interesting. I mean, you have countries that are officially not part of NATO, but are essentially they aren't neutral either, that their alignment is very Western and they cooperate and work with the Western countries. What I have found across from the United States in my unit, which I'll talk about in a moment, we had a large simulation center. And I visited the National Defense University in Poland, where they have their main simulation center. They can do multi-division simulations there. It's very spread out. They have room for all the units, a great many computer centers to operate this. And I started talking to the personnel, the sergeants and the corporals who will man the computer stations to aid each lower level commander and staff will have a computer station, and they will work with the simulation there. And it was exactly like working with my own sergeants and corporals who were their simulations experts. And by the way, I did this in English, in the Poles. Aside from a Polish accent, they were using the same simulations technologies, the same everything as the Americans. In fact, the Americans would send operational units, headquarters and staffs only, to play in operational maneuvers at the Polish center, which was set up for multinational operations. So this is now universal in Western nations, is having these simulation centers as an aid to operational exercises. It's a great system. So there is the unit that I belonged to for 8 years, which was one of several American units. Even as a reserve unit, about 5 times a year, we would travel out to a simulation center, and we would run a large-scale operational exercise for a brigade or maybe a large logistics command, or even a regular Army division. We would do these operational level simulations. Actually, a large-scale exercise would be planned with the unit up to a year in advance. This is not an ad hoc system. Well, I suppose if there was mobilization, we could do it very quickly, but these simulations were planned well in advance and in a very specific way. And I'll tell you how the team that does this. Now, in a training unit that runs simulations exercises, and by the way, this is not American at all. This is, again, Western Universal. You start with a scenario writing team, and they will develop the exercise in coordination with the unit that's the large unit being trained. And the commander of the large unit will tell the training unit, this is the kind of training that we need for our large unit. And these are our missions, and we want you to develop a scenario that will emphasize this, and this mission. And we say, yes, sir, and our team of scenario writers will go to work. Now, writing a scenario. Now, if you want a conventional war scenario, very often we simply used a Korean map. North and South Korea, conventional war scenario for Americans, it's pretty obvious. Back in the good old Cold War days, we would use real world units, real maps of Europe, and do a Soviet versus West scenario. Very realistic, not that difficult to write those scenarios. Today, we actually will take, let's say, a map of Eastern Europe, and NATO has several exercises that they've created with scenarios and politics and everything, and we will take a European map and we will make up names and make up some borders, but basically it would be an East-West scenario, and they will come up with crisis, war scenarios, and so on, and we will play fictional countries that sort of mirror NATO countries versus fictional enemies that pretty much mirror potential Eastern enemies, just have different names. But the point is, you write a scenario to try to get realistic problems for the unit to solve. And this is, again, forcing them to go through the planning process, develop options. At a higher level of conflict, a division corps commander directs his staff to come up with options in any given situation, and then to brief the options and choose various options. We also play, when you're playing a division, the emphasis, during the play, the division commander will be sending down directives to how he's going to make his brigades operate, and the brigades have to go through the planning process to carry out their part of the mission. And all of this is evaluated at the same time. Brigades, divisions, corps, every level is looked at during the game. A good scenario will do the kind of test and problem setting that's needed, and it will be very realistic. You will try to be as realistic as possible about the capabilities, your capabilities. I've been most scenarios, and I was very proud. I knew the people in my unit's scenario writing team, and they were artists, and they really developed realistic scenarios. Now, scenario writing team better be people who are very well versed in operational level conflict. They better, you need experts in infantry, artillery, transport and logistics and air to make this realistic. I had, when I was a student at the U.S. Air Force Air War College, we had one big operational exercise. The scenario was so awful and so unrealistic, and the capabilities were off the chart wrong, that there was a grandeur to this, its awfulness. And anyway, that not only was it bad training, it actually, I think, taught bad lessons to the people that participated in that. Anyway, I've seen wonderful scenarios, and then I've seen some that were some of the worst training ever developed. And And by the way, proudly as an American, we can do some of the greatest training in the world, and at the same time, we can do some of the worst training in the world. So anyway, for the most part, scenario writing team's important. And if they fail, the whole exercise will be a flop. So you need great scenario people. The blue team, that's just the term of the unit or units that are being exercised. And the red team, now this belonged to, again, our training unit. This is your professional opposing forces. And these people will, in simulations, play the enemy. And you want a really good, tough, smart opposing forces team that they're given realistic capabilities, and they will use, with all their talent in the simulations play, to oppose the blue team unit. Again, it's essential to have really good opposing forces. Now, the white team are the controllers. Now, on the computer screen, they are the only ones, and that's the exercise unit staff, that can actually see all of the units, the opposing forces and the friendly forces that are in play. And the white cell, they will throw in bad weather, and they will throw in different conditions. The bridges are out, whatever, to force different problems into play. They can see everybody. Now, the opposing forces can only see the friendly forces or the blue forces that their reconnaissance capabilities might have picked up, or they don't have a complete picture of their enemy. And the blue forces only have an incomplete picture of the opposing forces as well. And so when they're advancing units, you can run into ambushes, just like real life. So those are the white team. And the white team keeps a record. They have a snapshot of pretty much every minute of play. So when we do the after action at the end of each exercise segment, you can show the Blue Force commander, this is what you did, these are your movements. By the way, you lost half your tank battalion over here when they got stuck, or you did a brilliant job and you cut through the weak point of the opposing forces, but it's all mapped out, and so you can, just like at the big exercises that I talked about in the National Training Center where they use transponders, but you want to be able to visualize step by step what happened during the exercise in those computer snapshots. The final part of a simulations team, and the one I have a special place for, is the after action team. This is what I led in the 87th Division. I had people who were expert in the specialist units. I had my observers out at each subunit and major unit watching all they do is watch what happens and record what happens. And I will have a well-trained logistician there with the Division Corps Logistics Headquarters, and I will have a well-trained infantryman with their mechanized brigade watching the process and watching how they walk through the planning of the operation, how they write the operations order, and so on. And at the end of the exercise, all of my observers, we will put together and the first report is a briefing, and we've got just a few hours to do this, and we will tell each unit being exercised, these are the things that you are doing really well, and these are the things that you need to maintain your standard. Whether it's great coffee, maybe if you can't find any, you always have to say something nice about the unit. Great coffee, or you got there on time. No, seriously, usually we have something good to say about the units, and these were the things that you did especially well. And for the yearly training program, you know that you've got this down, keep it up. It says, we saw this, and this weakness. Now you always want to highlight 2 or 3 of the important things that they need to work on. And again, you need to document this and show this, the after-action report, because when we'll put together 2 products. We put together the initial briefing, which are the highlights, and we do that pretty quickly. But then we put in a written report where everything is detailed. You know, at the such and such logistics, you need to understand the doctrine of transshipping and so forth better than you do. And we put together a very detailed report. This detailed report will inform these large units how they need to train for the next year or 2. And so this is essential. And in fact, all military training is a circular system. You train up these skills, you have an exercise, and the exercise tells you what you have to get ready for, and then you exercise again and go through the process. And so the after-action team, that was my use. And by the way, there's a standard NATO doctrine, actually manuals, how to do an after-action report. An after-action report as this form, just as there is a NATO doctrine for planning and so on. And of course, I'm talking about doctrine. Doctrine is very important. It's essential. You can't do these things without a written doctrine. Military written doctrine is just the way you do things. Now, if you are a small unit, and I've been in a logistics specialty, handling ammunition, doctrine is virtually law. If you want to handle ammunition safely and efficiently and move and transport ammunition, you had better follow the rules on how to store it, keep it. By the way, if you follow the rules, it's very safe. I've run ammunition. I'm qualified to run an ammunition dump. I had to go through a course on this. If you don't follow the rules, terrible things will happen, as you can imagine. Same thing with fuel supplies. Huge part of the military as safety, fuel supplies. Aviation, if you do not follow the aviation maintenance book religiously, or even more than fanatically, then terrible things will happen. But when and this applies to the small unit skills. You must do these things, do it right. Now, at the operational level, you don't have laws, you have guidelines. And you should pretty much follow the guidelines in the planning process, but at times you can cut out a couple of things in the planning process. You can adapt guidelines. And this is where you get into the art of operations, is knowing when you can, apart from the norm, maybe do some things on the edge of the guidelines, but still normal. This is where it gets interesting in the planning process. So, but doctrine has those guidelines, and you can deviate from them. The point is, in exercise, is this military decision-making process is that when you are doing a plan for a major division, brigade maneuver, is you will come up, the staff, which I've been a staff officer for a long time, as the staff, you will prepare a couple of options. Option A, attack here, or option B, attack here, more reserves, whatever. And in each option, you will come up with a list, brief list of what are the advantages to this option, but what are the disadvantages too. And the commander will listen to his staff brief his planning options and then say, well, I will take option A, but I'm going to add 2 elements of option B. This is the normal planning process that you carry out. And it's an understanding that there is no perfect plan. Every plan, you have limitations, you have assumptions that you need to test and think about. You have strengths and weaknesses, and you have to do it in a certain time limit. So there is no perfect solution in operational warfare. What you're aiming for is a staff and commander who can come up with a pretty good, pretty smart solution that's not perfect and do it within the time limits and the capabilities that you're given and your resources that you're given. So that's where doctrine is a guideline to be followed. But that's really, it's about the decision-making process. Here is one of my favorite slides. During a planning process exercise, this is taken from the Baltic Defense College. And you have here in the middle, in the civilian clothes, that's a Polish General Staff colonel of long experience. And in the foreground, you have a Lithuanian colonel with long experience, War College graduate. On the far end, you have a Latvian colonel, and they are listening to a commander and staff presenting their solution for the exercise. And they're a tough audience. And these are the people that you are in an operational exercise who are going to essentially, at the briefing, tell you whether your options were good or bad, essentially as senior mentors. And you do this in a staff ride too. They will tell you, one thing I learned from being an operational commander is you forgot about how to use your reserves. Or, did you think about your logistics route when you only planned on having one route for supply? And they will come up with the reality, the tough things that you do. In other words, any operational exercise, you need some senior people with a lot of experience to sit back and give you a really tough critique of your exercise and just force you to think intelligently. There's several elements to a good exercise. Great scenario is essential. And a scenario will test all the elements. So a good scenario will involve the logistics units just as much as the combat units and the transport. And don't forget the medical and the air support and coordination for naval support and so forth and so on. We have deployment scenarios where they have to think through how to get port facilities and what port facilities to reinforce and support. I mean, a good scenario is a detailed one and not a general one. And you might include in your scenario civil affairs might play an important role depending on the kind of exercise that you're doing. The civilian elements, in other words, multinational political cooperation and support. And in the case that we played in the military staff colleges, and we do this in European NATO countries as well, even the small countries, we will bring in people who have been ambassadors. And they will tell you, well, realistically, this is what the political advisor would do in terms of transport rights or civil law or whatever. So this is a level, an operational exercise, you will often bring in civilians to play realistic civilian scenarios. And of course, you need a great opposing forces. And not only just conventional war, now you have to think of opposing forces that use cyber attacks and disinformation and deception. At Fort Leavenworth, we had some good operational exercises where we forced the commanders and staff to think about the media and how you give media interviews to the press and explain military operations. And we actually used real-life journalists to sort of train our people how to present statements to the press. So you can use all kinds of elements in an operational level war game. And a small country, we did this in the Baltic Defense College as well, all kinds of things. So that's an operational simulations exercise. War games. This has been part of Western military culture since, especially the Germans in the 19th century. And a definition is it's a warfare model or simulation that does not involve actual troops. Again, like an exercise, it is commanders and staffs playing roles. When I was 10 and a half, my older brother got a board game called Africa Corps. It's a great game. And it was about combat in North Africa, 1941, 1942. And you involved logistics and naval supplies and movement and so forth. Board games, I don't know how popular they are in Catalunya, but certainly when I used to play them all. When I was a second lieutenant, I was at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, at the intelligence officer course. And it's a pretty isolated place in the Arizona mountains. And there's not a lot to do most nights. So I and the other brand new lieutenants, we used to drink beer and play war games. In those days, this is the late 70s, Cold War, we used to play, we played a lot of them were about the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1973, because that was for us what a model of Western versus Soviet kind of warfare was, all the latest weapons and so on. So board games are still wonderful. And it's interesting, in 1990, the moment that Saddam Hussein made his invasion of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, that day the Pentagon planners heard of this and they went out, and there was a brand new board war game on the market about Middle Eastern conflict. It was done by a very good author who had implied several major Middle Eastern powers in conventional war. They went out and they bought up every single available game in the civilian bookstores. And they brought them back to the Pentagon and they started playing the Middle Eastern war game simply to conceptualize the kind of problems and issues that these are professional war planners. And by the way, they did pretty good. They started conceptualizing and understanding strengths and weaknesses and problems literally at the very beginning. And remember that we sent a huge armed forces. That included British and French divisions to Saudi Arabia in that first Gulf War. Assessment. Now here is where a war game can go really wrong. Remember, when I talked about one of the purposes of an operational exercise or war game is to assess doctrine. Now in 2002, the Joint Forces Command, the U.S. military, decided that they had a group of military conceptual experts had come together with a new doctrine, air, land, naval, something, whatever the great jargon was at the time. They had come up with a new doctrine, and they wanted to test out their high-tech war doctrine. They had an enormous war game. In this war game, it lasted months, by the way, they actually had employed large units, simulated. 17 simulation centers were linked together to play this game. They had 9 regular military force sites that were involved, again, playing staffs and commanders in simulation to test this new Army, this new armed forces, it was all services, Army, Navy, Air Force doctrine. And it was a very large and expensive effort, and it went completely wrong. The problem was, and this is why you had a separate training unit like the one I was in. When I went to train somebody, or a unit went to train somebody, we're objective. We're not under that unit. That unit does not write my officer efficiency report. So if I say something mean about this unit and how they performed, in the after-action report, they can't come back and get me. what happened is you do not want to have people who developed the concepts run the war game. And this is what happened. The same people who developed the concept, set the rules of the game, wrote the scenario for the game. Well, what you had in this war game is you had a very, very capable retired Army general, Paul Van Riper, 3-star general, pretty much known as a brilliant operational level guy, put together a very strong Red Force, opposing forces to the Joint Forces Command. Well, the concept developers running the war game, because they ran the white cell, said, oh no, you can't shoot down our aircraft. None of your anti-aircraft defenses are going to work against our system, so you can't do this. Every time the opposing forces came up with some very good tactics and counters that were realistic, the white cell, which was run by the people that wrote the doctrine, said, oh no, this won't work, you're not allowed to do that. So after a short period, halfway through this war game, the commanding general of the opposing forces quit. Says, that's it, I'm not playing this anymore, I'm not playing your game. He remained as an observer, but they wouldn't let the opposing forces literally fight. And so the game, of course, proves that the concept developers, who judged themselves, had a brilliant concept of warfare. And actually, it was a few years before the whole story got out. And in fact, the 2002 war game was, in reality, it showed that Joint Forces Command really didn't have the right doctrine. Never again, you never let the people that write the war game run the war game. You have to have objectivity. So there's some very good lessons there. Now, I'm going to talk about the war game that never happened. 1995, there was a multinational, American-led military intervention in Haiti. Haiti had collapsed and just imploded, anarchy. So the Western forces came in, and they remained for a year in Haiti. And they did civil affairs, and they trained people, and they restored order, or tried to. And when they left Haiti a year later, Haiti was as messed up as it was the day that they intervened. It was very much a flop. Even the UN, which gave it its sanction, pretty much saw the Haiti intervention was a failure. End of the 1990s, I was invited up to the Special Forces Command. They developed a new war game based on the Haiti scenario. In the 1990s, I was one of a very small number of people in the entire American military education system that actually taught courses in irregular conflict. In other words, small wars, conflict against non-state enemies, insurgencies. After the first Gulf War, this was completely ignored in the US. In fact, they tried to have a course in the mid-1990s at the Army Command Staff College on fighting irregular insurgents, and there was no interest in it, so it was dropped. And after 9/11, guess who we end up fighting? Yes, non-state enemies. Well, anyway, in around 2000, I was invited up to Fort Bragg for a week and to play this new war game. And it was based on Haiti. And it had up to 28 different factions, which paralleled. And in a situation like Haiti, it's not about conventional war. It's about local warlords, political factions, organized crime cartels. All of these different factions. And if you went in and did some civic action, for example, you would win the support of 3 or 4 or 5 factions, and local support would be great. By the way, you also made enemies of this warlord and this crime cartel by whatever you did. And you could jump forward in time and see what effect that your civic action did. It helped the local economy. But by the way, now you have gotten into a security conflict with this, and this faction. It was an incredibly complex game. And it was meant to teach people that when you go into a situation like Haiti, what kind of messy politics that it's not all about division tank war. The one war that the U.S. military prepared for, it was in these kinds of conflicts, there were no easy solutions. There were no black and white. And by the way, one faction would support you one day, and then you do something, and then they turn against you and they go into opposition. This was all part of, and it was a brilliant war game, by the way, and I never heard of it again. They played it, they developed it, and it worked, and we didn't hear of it. A year and a half later, we have 9/11. We go into Afghanistan. Now, we could have taken the Haiti game, and instead of 28 Haitian factions, warlords, crime cartels, Afghanistan, we could have had, Afghanistan has 14 major tribes, 14 plus. They also have the opium cartels, they have warlords. We could have adapted this game to Afghanistan and at least taught our commanders and staffs the complexity of what they were getting into. And unfortunately, we didn't. So it's the war game that was never played, and it didn't happen. I'm not sure what happened to it. It was a great idea. I think it was just too strange for a armed forces leadership that was so devoted to the Cold War and had gotten the Cold War right, the big armored and air tank battles and so on, that you put them in Iraq and Afghanistan in an unconventional war situation where tribal militia is your friend one day, and then a few weeks later, for usually for rational reasons of their own, they switch sides and now they're your opponents. Our leadership could not get their heads around it. By the way, the Europeans weren't really any better. Sometimes they were worse in Afghanistan. In other words, this was a failure of Western military education to prepare our senior leaders, military leaders, for the kind of war that we unfortunately got into. Not the kind of war we liked. But anyway, that was... Now, there are many reasons why I think that the Western forces failed in Afghanistan. And there's lots of blame to go around. But one thing I think we would have done a lot better if we had had the right kind of operational exercise. And remember, these things do not cost a lot of money. It would not have been hard to get commanders and staffs and have them play a computer simulation of Haiti or adapted to Afghanistan. And unfortunately, nobody really wanted to push that issue, so we didn't train. And it was not adopted for use. By the way, war games. Here's just a picture I liked. It's a bunch of Marines at one of the Marine Corps training centers. What do they spend their Marine officers do in their off time? They drink beer and they play. This is playing a tactical board game. And I recommend any good military has lots of board gamers. Staff rides. Now, a staff ride is using a historical battlefields to teach military decision making. Now, it's history fun, you learn the history, but partly the main reason why it is adaptable and useful for modern officers to do is that you will look at a historical situation. Well, what were the decisions that commander and staff made about in their planning, in their allocation of forces, use of reserves, and you force your students to think through key questions that will occur anytime you do a military operation. And so you walk through the history of that. Now, and when you do this, you'll use the original, I've done U.S. Civil War. We have actually all the operational orders and battle reports that were written by both sides for every major battle. And it's very interesting when you're playing the commander because you have the intelligence and you know the units and their dispositions, and you have his intent and his commander's orders in front of you. And then you go over to the division commander opposing him, and you have all of the orders and reports. You try to see a battle through their eyes, what they knew and what their intent and mission was. But we use historical war games, and we develop questions that you have to think through and it's really for students, about intelligence, about use of terrain, about a commander giving clear guidance or giving over-detailed guidance and not allowing for adaptation. And going over the terrain is a great learning technique. Visuals. You can visualize it on a map, but to actually go in person and see what terrain is like it's very moving. It's also something that you will always remember. Now, what we've done, I can give my favorite example, best war game, staff ride, I've ever been on. The British Army Staff College ran a staff ride in 2018 of the 1918 offensives. So they went to the ground where the Germans in March had made the March breakthrough attack. And then they went to the ground where the French and the Americans had made the first great counterattack against the Germans at Soissons. Then back to northern France, where the British campaign broke the Hindenburg Line September to November 1918. And then we ended up in the Meuse-Argonne, the American offensive of September to November 1918. And we walked the ground. And the students, we formed the students, every staff college does this. The Baltic Defense College, the British Staff College, we have syndicates of students, and there'll be about 10 to 12 students in the syndicate. And the syndicates are all multinational. At the Baltic Defense College with Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Americans, a Pole, a Finn. In every case, you have a multinational student group because in the British staff rides, mostly British, but we also had a large American contingent, a French contingent from their staff college, and a German staff college contingent. Every syndicate contained mostly British, but Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen. And you will give, on the same terrain, what we would do, and this we did the Baltic Defense College too, is after going through the historical part, we would tell a syndicate that they were a modern, let's say, brigade or division headquarters. And they were given the mission with modern equipment, Western equipment and doctrine, to attack or defend on this map terrain. And they had to come up with a quick and dirty tactical operations plan and brief that to senior officers. And you're seeing it when I pointed out the Baltic Defense College, the exercise, the senior mentors. We had a couple of British retired generals, people who had been corps and division commanders, and vast experience. And they would have to brief these people, and again, very critical people, very knowledgeable, critical people going through their solution for their syndicate. And each syndicate had to do this learning process. So we had the historical part where we ask questions, learn about the questions, but then we actually made them do a modern part. And staff rides were great experiences. You can have a lot of fun at staff rides. We got reenactors. We had two big staff rides at the Baltic Defense College. One was the Estonian Islands Campaign, 1917. After Gallipoli, the second largest amphibious operation, World War I. There were battleship fleets involved, Russian and German, 40,000 troops, amphibious landing on the Estonian islands, tens of thousands Russian defenders. It had enough air power. There were 200 German aircraft with a separate air operations annex. Reads just like a modern operations order. So we had, these guys are great. They didn't cost anything, really. We had Estonians coming out and in proper costume playing the Germans, and we had Estonians who were dressed up as Russian sailors and soldiers out doing some demonstrations in the field. This is just for fun. But again, you can learn history and use it as a teaching tool very effectively. But we also had a 1944, again, which was the site of a big campaign, Russians versus the Germans in northern Estonia. And again, we would do the historical part and then do a modern defense on the same ground, and making the different syndicates play a modern role in having to develop a plan and brief it. Now, here is the staff ride I was on, and it was the one at Soissons. This is a syndicate getting ready to do their briefing. And there on the one side, we have a French officer. In the middle, we have a British officer, and behind him a British, and in the foreground an American officer, and they're all getting ready to get up and brief their generals. It was a very, there we are in the Hindenburg line, there's American in foreground, some British, senior British officer who's just observing. It was a great group, a multinational group. Now here were our two mentors. We broke the syndicates into large groups, a group of syndicates. And here we have a retired British Major General and former division commander, and he's assembling his group of syndicates who will have to brief him, and that's at Soissons. And Lieutenant General retired Mungo Melvin, again, former commander of all the British troops in Germany. Talk about reenactors. That is an actual FT-17 Renault tank. That is not a reproduction. That was one that actually was in that battle. And in fact, it came to us as we assembled at the battle spot. It chugged at 8 miles an hour right up in front of us, and it still has little bullet dents in the armor from 1917. Great little, again, reenactor tool. And these, by the way, the British generals really made the staff ride work because they were just experienced and they knew operational level brilliantly. Finally, in this very simple conclusion, is that an effective operational or any military training system has to be part of a single comprehensive system. It means that every country, whether it's the United States or whether it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, has to have at their top levels of the military a single command that oversees all doctrine writing and all training, from the lowest level to the highest level, to make sure that it is all systematic, that it syncs, and it's done in coordination. And that is the norm in best practices. And by the way, the training command will be in constant contact with other training commands and employing the best practices that can be found in the Western nations. So, as I said, I have been to Polish and Austrian and Estonian and simulation centers. I've seen their training commands. And in the West, there's actually just about a universal standard. There's also a standard of doctrine at the Baltic Defense College. We use the NATO. It's called the Comprehensive Operation Planning Doctrine, the COPD. I've provided you with a computer stick with a lot of regulations and training and doctrine materials. I've given you actually the old version of the NATO doctrine that we used as the standard. and it has the NATO planning system and the NATO op briefing. The Americans have a slight variation maybe in their operations order, and the British have. By the way, they're all very close. And so we taught to the NATO standard, which is actually pretty good. And this explains the entire military process at the operational level. So you want to have a comprehensive system that puts all of this together, and you want to emphasize for a smaller country, multinational operations and the role that they play, because they can play important roles. You won't find a smaller nation. Sometimes they can take a leadership role at a lower level, like in Afghanistan, the Lithuanians did a very good job in running the provincial reconstruction team. They were the lead nation in that large province of Afghanistan, and they had the other countries that were involved working for them. But having the multinational part is key to smaller nations. If a smaller nation, this is why I keep saying that you need to have the train to the full Western standard. A smaller nation will not lead a major NATO intervention. Belgium is not going to lead a major NATO intervention. However, Belgium will take part in that. And the Belgian officers, to be effective, have got to have essentially the same training and understanding of operations as any American or any Briton or any German. And that's the reality today that we train to is multinational standard. And this is why you need a comprehensive system run out of the Defense Ministry. And finally, last point, integrating your training and operational practice is an art, but that's something that I will talk about at another time. Thank you.